We're going to be starting off the show by diving into the Monday Night Football last night between the Detroit Lions and the Seattle Seahawks. So we already have comments here asking about this game, about how did the Seahawks do. The Seahawks, this was a game that sort of was to determine whether or not this was a fraudulent 3-0. Now, not that you can fully answer that question ever in just one game, but this was definitely a huge prove-it spot for Seattle going up against one of the best teams in the NFL in the Detroit Lions, and ultimately it ended up being a battle. Now, it took the Seahawks a little bit to sort of work into what their identity was in this game and what it should be going forward, and that is leaning on Kenneth Walker, who is an absolute animal, and he continued to prove that last night. Yesterday was his first game back from the oblique injury that he suffered in week 1, and he was incredible. 12 carries, 80 yards, and 3 touchdowns, another 36 yards through the receiving game as well. And Kenneth Walker, I mean, you just see the strength of his build and the balance that he has, just bouncing off of defenders and continuing to go. One of his touchdown runs down at the goal line was basically lit up immediately and was able to bounce off and get to the outside for a touchdown. So that is a massive positive for the Seahawks. Overall, like I mentioned, this was an offensive shootout on both sides of the ball here. I think it was probably, from an offensive perspective, a little bit more important for the Lions to have a game like this than the Seahawks, considering the fact that the Lions, more than anything, are built around that offense. I know the defense has been the side of the ball that has been carrying the Lions a little bit more through the first 3 weeks of the season. But the reality of the situation is, I think we do understand there are some shortcomings with that Lions defense. Now, a lot of it was self-inflicted. Penalties off the charts in this game. I think it was over 100 penalty yards for the Lions. So they didn't do themselves any favors allowing the Seahawks to hang around in this game. And the Seahawks were more often than not able to capitalize on that. But that being said, the defense, it has its issues. Specifically, you look at that secondary, and I thought that Carlton Davis did a pretty good job, all things considered. Him facing off against DK Metcalf, that was obviously a massive storyline surrounding the game as a whole. But I think that ultimately here, this was a game that Jared Goff really, really needed because of the fact that he really hadn't looked great through the first few weeks of the season. Him and the offense as a whole just weren't really clicking on that level that we saw last year. Goff was just signed to a $212 million contract this past offseason. So we were sort of waiting to see, just, for all intents and purposes, to back up that contract, at least to some degree. We're still early in the season, so it's not like it was anywhere near panic levels up going into last night. But it was a very nice reminder to show that Jared Goff is sort of the stability of this offense as a whole. He's not the identity. I think that was shown last night, that it was through the ground game, the two-headed monster of David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs running together. They were both very impressive in this game. You look at ultimately, they were able to combine for 118 yards and 3 touchdowns together on the ground. Really impressive there. But Jared Goff, again, just sort of the leader of this offense as a whole. He had a perfect completion percentage, 18 of 18, 292 yards, 2 passing touchdowns, and even caught a touchdown as well, where the Lions developed some sort of trick play where it was Amon-Ra St. Brown throwing to Jared Goff coming out of the backfield. Really impressive stuff there from the Lions offense as a whole. Like I mentioned, this was a two-way street though. Geno Smith was also very impressive in this game. 38 of 56, 395 yards, touchdown and an interception. He had career highs in completions and passing yards. That 395 yards mark is now the highest in the NFL so far this season. So a lot of positives to come out of this game on both sides. But again, I think the most important aspect of this is the Lions putting together a full game's worth of great football. And it was, again, more so on the offensive side of the ball than defense, but that is also sort of what their calling card is. And their defense has shown up to this point in the season that they have made improvements on the defensive side of the ball. But I think that ultimately the Lions aren't going to be Super Bowl contenders by winning low-scoring games game in and game out. They're going to need to put up points, and they sort of reminded the national audience once again that they are capable of it, that last year was not a fluke. And it was Goff, of course, having an incredible game himself. Like I mentioned, it was establishing the ground game. This was the Lions' first game as well without Pro Bowl center Frank Ragnow. And ultimately, they did a pretty good job of being able to make the replacement. We saw instead it was Graham Glasgow starting at center. It was Coyote Shosika. I totally just mispronounced that. I'm going to double check there. But they ended up having, a former undrafted free agent. It was Coyote Oshika. And he did, former undrafted free agent. He has started a handful of games for the Lions. He did in the NFC Championship game last year. ESPN had him third on the Detroit depth chart. And it just goes to show they continue to produce from an offensive line standpoint as well. And that is one of the most underappreciated parts of this Lions franchise, is that they just continually dominate the trenches, both in the pass game and the run game, and that's what makes them so special. And then really one of the other takeaways from last night as well is seeing the continued development of Jameson Williams in this offense, where obviously his career gets off to a bit of a sloppy start because of injuries and off the field issues, but now here he is, and he has a 70-yard touchdown in the third quarter where you can just see that blow away speed, just leaving everybody in the dust there. That's his, I believe, third play of the season so far, with that is 50 or more yards. So again, adding that extra explosive element to this Lions offense has also been massive for them. And, it's not like Amon-Ra St. Brown isn't explosive in his own right, but I feel like he's a little bit more methodical. And Jameson Williams is just able to, and you look at that play in particular as well, it's the extra attention that Amon-Ra draws, and having somebody like Jameson Williams be able to spark those big plays. It's sort of similar to what we talked about yesterday with Justin Jefferson for the Vikings, and now you add Jordan Addison into that offense as well, and it just causes nightmares for opposing defenses. But sort of circling back here to the Seahawks as well, as Lil Fettuccine asks, can we see a rematch come playoff time? I do think that it is very possible. Now, the Seahawks are the team that I myself have had maybe a little bit of reservations about. Their, catalog of wins through that 3-0 start wasn't ultimately that impressive. Not that you play who's on your schedule, so it's not that it's their fault at all. Maybe I would have liked them to see them be a little bit more convincing against the Patriots, but you're talking about wins against Bo Nix in his first ever NFL game, the Patriots, who are very clearly not a good team, and as well you have a Tua Tagovailoa-less Miami Dolphins, which we also saw them play last night, and they are obviously offensively a disaster right now. So when I talk about, where the Seahawks are at this point and whether or not they can hang with the best teams in the NFL, I think that this is a situation where there is a lot of good you can come out of this. Like I mentioned, Kenneth Walker being the identity of that offense, I think is the direction I'd like to see them go. Now, that offensive line maybe at times has a little bit of concerns, for whatever it's worth. I would add that they seem to have one of their rookie guards, Christian Haynes, who ended up coming in for Anthony Bradford. He looked pretty good. That offensive line is an area that I don't love. So, just throwing it out there that maybe Haynes could be somebody who takes on a bigger role for the Seahawks team, as again, I think they're going to need to be able to run the ball. Geno Smith, excellent last night, having another great season, and that is massively encouraging. That being said, though, I think that there are maybe areas that, you're going to, and I don't want to be disrespectful to Geno Smith, because again, he's been very impressive up to this point in the season. Maybe it's just the sort of bias in the back of my head that Geno Smith, he's still not one of those star quarterbacks. He has a ton of weapons around him. DK Metcalf with another huge game in this one. Jackson Smith and Jigba, who, for second time in 3 weeks, put together a very nice game for himself. So they have all kinds of pieces, but I really do feel like their best path to having success is operating the run game with Kenneth Walker. And then defensively, obviously, you give up 42 points. That is a very bad sign, especially, Mike McDonald, their head coach. He has a defensive background, so I'm sure he's going to be maybe pulling a little bit of hair out in film sessions, but also you take into consideration, and injury excuses, they can only go so far, but objectively speaking, the Seahawks were missing a number of key players on that defensive side of the ball. 5 of their crucial front 7 players, Boye Mafe, who's been a revelation for them, Leonard Williams, one of their big investments over the past couple seasons, rookie Byron Murphy, linebacker Jerome Baker, edge rusher Uchenna Nwosu. So, and add into that as well that Julian Love ended up leaving this game as well in the third quarter. So it's a situation where you definitely want their defense to perform better. I do feel like McDonald is a good enough head coach and a strategist from a defensive perspective that he can do a good job of sort of putting these guys in positions to succeed. But that was to have a depleted front 7 against that Detroit Lions rushing attack and that offense, I think is an extremely tough matchup. And what the Seahawks did show is if it comes down to them having to score 3-4 touchdowns in a game, they're capable of doing so. That being said, you would like to have the defense perform a little bit better, but that's definitely an area I think that they can improve upon once they get some of these key pieces back that, if I'm not mistaken, aren't supposed to be out all too long. So the Seahawks season, yes, they suffer a loss, but they're very much still alive in this NFC race. And, you especially look at the NFC West, where I think that is a very open division as things currently stand. The Cardinals and the Rams both suffering losses this past weekend. The 49ers, they're in a situation where I would still pick them to win the division out there in the NFC West. But with all the injuries piling up, it's possible that the Seahawks, who do typically tend to play the 49ers pretty well, that they could insert themselves into that division champ status and maybe even into a real playoff threat. I don't know if I'm quite ready to go there just yet, but I do think that there were a lot of positive signs coming out of this game that the Seahawks can continue to build on. But let me know what your thoughts were in the comments section. But this was the second straight week of having multiple Monday Night Football games going on at once. The other one did not have the same offensive firepower as this one, as the Tennessee Titans secured their first win of the season when they were able to defeat the Miami Dolphins. So we are going to dive into that. But first, I do want to address a quick comment here from Lil Fettuccini from Seattle. To be honest, for 3 weeks, they were not looking good in the games that they won, that the Lions could have exposed them big time. I don't know if the Seahawks can win one game against the 49ers this year. It's a situation, I understand the doubts. I'm definitely not all aboard the Seahawks hype train right now. Like I said, I think that there are positives. That being said, you're sort of banking on a lot in terms of defensively. You can sort of chalk it up to injuries, but the reality is you got to go play football. They ended up getting run through in that game. The 49ers are another team that can also control the line of scrimmage. So you're going to have teams like that on your schedule. Niners not at full power yet. I'll double check here what the schedule looks like for when the Seahawks would be going on to face the 49ers, where They have the Niners in 2 weeks. I mean, that might be a game where they are able to, at least catch the Niners at a tougher time. But, I mean, I'm also with you. I think the 49ers are the better team right now, even with the injuries considered. But just saying, the door is open for the Seahawks at this point. And I feel like year one of Mike Macdonald in Seattle, that is probably what the majority of Seahawks fans would take. So, that being said, we are going to be moving on here to the other game from last night, Titans versus the Dolphins. We are going to be diving into that. But before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.